First of all, just thank you for being here today. It's a pleasure to gather with people that represent our city, state, and community leaders, other stakeholders who share similar interests in the challenging issues we face with regard to Utah's shared resources. Today we are discussing something of a somewhat mathematical topic, which is probability estimates to make better decisions for the future. You'll hear from two of our researchers today, Dr. Brennan L from USU's Department of Mathematics and Statistics, and Dr. Wei Zhang from USU's Department of Plants, Soils, and Climate. Before we get started, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank O.C. Tanner for supporting this event series, and I'd like to especially thank them for our ongoing partnership to enable us to use this beautiful space for our Research Landscapes events. We all know that Utah is known in part for its magnificent snow. The accumulation of that snow is a critical factor for our state, both for our economy and as we think about how do we construct buildings to withstand the snow we receive. Using historical data, we've been able to establish building codes and make other essential decisions. But what if our future doesn't resemble our past? And we all know, just looking at the changes we see in climate, that things can vary quite dramatically. That's why we have Dr. Bean and Dr. Zhang here today. They will show us how data science and domain expertise can work together to create probability estimates that decision makers can act on. They'll talk primarily about the future of Utah's snow, but these lessons are actually applicable in any circumstance that requires decisions to be made with uncertain outcomes. This kind of research combines efforts from different fields, and this approach has become increasingly valuable to address the complicated challenges faced by our society today. This type of interconnected approach to research, one that turns data and observation into real-world application, is a hallmark of Utah State University's research efforts. And so, to get us started today, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about each of our speakers. And so, we're excited to have Drs. Bean and Zhang with us today. Dr. Brennan Bean is an assistant professor of statistics. Prior to his faculty appointment, he earned a PhD in mathematical sciences from Utah State. His research focuses on finding better ways to analyze environmental data to improve decision-making in terms of infrastructure design and agriculture. Dr. Bean also enjoys the teaching part of his role to teach the next generation of statisticians how to use computer programming to explore and visualize data. When he's not in the office, Dr. Bean loves to be outside, hiking, biking, and on adventures with his wife and two children. Dr. Wei Zhang is an assistant professor in, as I said, our Department of Plants, Soils, and Climate, which is in the College of Agriculture and Applied Sciences. He earned his PhD from the Chinese University of Hong Kong and has spent time as a visiting scholar at the University of Cambridge and as a postdoctoral researcher at Princeton University. Dr. Zhang has been at Utah State about 5 years. He's a climate scientist with a strong passion to understand the interface between climate and hydrology, a term that can be described as hydroclimate. Dr. Zhang uses numerical and statistical models to study hydroclimate. He was inspired to pursue this area of research when he noticed the decreasing snowfall in the hometown he grew up in. He enjoys cooking with his wife and spending time outdoors with his kids. And so it is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Bean and Dr. Zhang to make their presentation today. And before we get started, I will just remind you that afterward there will be a Q&A session where we very much value you asking questions that are important to you about the topics. And so, without anything further, Dr. Bean, Dr. Zhang.
Thank you, Dr. Perot. We're grateful for this opportunity to speak to you together. The way that this problem that we're going to talk about worked out is I'll be doing the majority of the talking today, but it could have very easily been the reverse. And perhaps in the future, next time we do this, it'll be the reverse. And so just a little bit about myself. Sorry, I'm getting some feedback from that mic, so I might come over to this side. This picture was taken 2 weeks ago, so now you understand how stressful these kind of talks can be on a person with the loss of hair. No, this was a while ago. My background was in mathematics and then statistics. I got into snow when I had the option to clean cabins in Bear Lake for a summer or do a research RA, and I happened to be in snow, and here I am all these years later.
So, my name is Wei Zhang. I am a climate scientist. I landed at USU in January 2021. I got that training both in hydrology and climate science. I spent time in University of Cambridge as a visiting scholar, 2 years at Princeton University, and then NOAA's National Lab that working on numeric modeling. So the lab that I work in is called the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory, acronym is GFDL. So that model developed the first kind of model in the world. I had that training both in climate science and hydrology, and I have been working on hydroclimate to understand the snowpack drought in the western US.
And so we're first going to tell you an academic love story. And I remember the first time that I laid eyes on Wei. I don't actually remember the very first time, but it's important to this problem that we're working on together, and that is that Wei and I were part of the same proposal writing institute sponsored by the Office of Research at Utah State University. And we didn't go into that intending to work with each other. We both had our own ideas for grants, and we happened to, during that process, read each other's material and begin to understand ways in which we could work with each other on future projects. And what you're seeing today is that coming to fruition after that institute, writing grants together, and one of them getting funded. But that's not the only thing that we've worked on.
Yeah, we have been submitted more than 8 proposals and 4 get funded. From federal agencies, NOAA, from the state agencies, from internal grants. So we have been collaborating students. I think it has been a great pleasure to work together with Brennan over the years.
And I think it highlights the opportunities that are unique to institutions like Utah State to bring people from very different backgrounds together to just start talking without any expectation for what the ROI is going to be, but ultimately seeing the return on investment with the kind of projects we work on. In fact, in the car, while we're driving down, we got talking about, hey, could we have a student work on this? And so who knows what's next? And so I'm going to take the floor for a little bit to go through a problem that I've been working on for several years and that now Wei's making better with me as we think about a future climate. And that problem is that many places, including most of Utah, have to design buildings to be able to withstand the weight of snow on the roof of the structure. So that's me in the Grand Targhee National Forest, and that's an outhouse, and I can tell you that outhouse is not going down, okay? It's designed well. But you can see that with enough time and accumulation, that snow can exert a substantial weight, and in many cases, it governs the design of the roof of a structure. Because if we don't design properly, we get buildings that look like this, that begin to collapse on themselves, they lose their function. Sometimes it even leads to the loss of life. So we know that the consequences are clear if we under-design a building, not having it be rated to hold enough snow or any other environmental hazard it needs to withstand. But the problem is also on the other side, that if we make buildings really strong like bomb shelters or military structures, we spend a lot of money making things safer than they probably need to be, and it becomes impractical to build the buildings that we need people to live in. And Utah's in the middle of a housing crisis, and so we have to balance safety and economy, and the only way to do that is with probability estimates, but that all gets complicated by the fact that we don't have just one probability distribution, that we say, okay, this is how snow works, this is how structures work. We have a climate that's evolving, which means that the threat of snow is changing. How do we account for what we have not yet seen using probability? And so the key point that I want to make is that we aren't just designing structures based on what we've seen. We're designing structures based on what we might see given probability estimates. And the reason we have to do that is if we've seen it and we design just to that, we're probably going to have structures failing a lot more often than we want. Because if I told you that your home had a 2% chance of failing due to excess snow loading any given year, I think you'd be really uncomfortable with that. So we have to push that probability of failure to be much lower than, say, 2%. And so it becomes an estimate based on this balance between withstanding the weight of snow but not becoming too strong to be unaffordable. Now, we could argue where that line is, and we're not going to argue that today. But given the mandates that structural engineers in the United States have set for what probabilities of failure are acceptable, Wei and I are trying to figure out how to meet those targets using both historical data and future climate information. And so how do we determine these probabilities? Well, here's a quick crash course on probability distributions. When I talk about the shape of a probability distribution, I'm talking about the shape of this blue curve and this black curve. And so the idea is, looking at the blue curve representing snow load, or the weight of snow, we could easily talk about snow water equivalent, or the amount of water in the snowpack. We don't know what it's going to be any given year. We sure wish we could, and I think Wei's working on how we could forecast that. But we don't know what it's going to be any given year, but we have a good idea of what it might be within certain ranges. And so for this blue curve, there's a good chance that in any given year, our weight of snow would be 10 to 20 PSF. And this is no particular location, it's just for illustration. There's some chance that the snow is much higher than that, say 30 or 40 PSF. But based on the shape of this curve, this blue curve, the chance of that happening is unlikely, but not zero. In engineering, we can't just think about the blue curve. We also have to think about the black curve, which represents the strength of the building materials that we use to design a structure. So I don't know how this building was designed. I'm not an engineer. I'm a statistician in engineer's clothing, or an engineer in statistician's clothing, I don't know. But I'm guessing that we have joists, probably steel, supporting this roof. And each one of those joists is rated to a certain strength, but they're not all exactly the same strength. They're going to vary based on some probability distribution. And so the black curve represents the uncertainty we have in the materials we're using to construct buildings. And so the way that we are calculating what we call a reliability targeted load is we're playing a game where we pit the blue curve versus the black curve. And the structure loses if the value we simulate from the blue curve is larger than the value that we simulate from the black curve. And we want to make that black curve be high enough, these materials be strong enough, that probability of those two things crossing each other becomes very low. And so the key point is that we're using probability distributions, multiple distributions, together to determine this, what we call a reliability targeted load, which is an interaction between the environment and the structure that we've designed. One of the issues that we have both within Utah and across the United States is that the way that we receive snow has different probability distribution shapes depending on where you're at. So as an example, if I'm in Park City, Utah, I can count on there being a lot of snow every given year. Some years are more or less than others. It's probably always going to be more than whatever Salt Lake City got. That's going to look more like this red curve, where the typical year, in fact, it would be the red curve shifted even higher than this. They've been scaled so that they seem similar. But Park City is going to have a curve shaped like red, and the key point is that because in Park City, the maximum snow load, or you think about Alta or any of these great ski resorts, the maximum snow load is going to be formed by the accumulation of many snowstorms over a long period of time. And one of the great things that statistics says is that when you take a random process, which in this case is snowstorms, and you add a bunch of them together, it changes the shape of the probability distribution. So the probability distribution of the sum has a different shape than the probability distribution of the individual storms. In particular, it's tame in the upper end of this. The difference between the typical snow season and the super extreme is substantial, but from a relative standpoint is much less than what we might see in this green curve. In Utah, places that look like the green curve would be Kanab, maybe Salt Lake a little bit, where the typical snow year is really not that much snow. But occasionally, and in Utah it was in the late 80s, we even had a pretty big year in 2023, we get substantial accumulations, even in places that don't see a lot of snow typically. And so the reason why that's important is that we're not designing buildings to withstand the typical snow year. When I say typical, I mean once every 5, 10, or even 20 years. We're designing buildings for the most extreme events. And so for that, we have to focus on the upper ends of these probability distributions, green, blue, and red, black representing the resistance of the structure. And in this particular example, even though the typical snow year coming from a green curve was less than the other two curves, the super extreme years are actually greater in this example. And so this leads to what feels like a paradox sometimes, where design standards are large in places where you're like, we don't see that much snow, but we could see that much snow. And that's the point of these probability calculations. And so I'm going to illustrate this with a tale of 3 cities, tale being probability distributions. And these are cities across the country, but we can think of Minneapolis kind of looking more like our Logans, and Baltimore and Boston maybe looking more like our Salt Lake City's Provos or south of that. And why we use these 3 places is that the differences are even more extreme when it comes to their water received during the winter months. Now, that doesn't mean snow, just any kind of water. And what we see is that Minneapolis receives, compared to Baltimore and Boston, much less water during the winter months. But it's also much colder, so you can bet that water in Minneapolis is probably always going to come as snow. As opposed to Baltimore and Boston, where we're getting lots of water, but at warmer winter temperatures. This is the coldest month temperature. So a lot of times that water comes as rain, and it doesn't accumulate. But in the right years, and for right, meaning lots of snow, Snowmageddon, I think was 2010 in Baltimore, we can see incredible accumulations very quickly that rival places like Minneapolis that get lots of snow all the time. And so from a probability standpoint, these are the annual maximum snow loads from each one of these 3 cities plotted as histograms. And it's just counting the number of times the snow load was about that value. And so the key point from this curve is when you look at Minneapolis, consistently the snow load is getting around 20 PSF, I would say probably once every 5 years or so. In Baltimore, it's doing that maybe once every 30 years or so, or 50 years or so. But when we look at the maximum accumulations in Minneapolis, Baltimore, and Boston, they end up looking fairly similar, all around 30 to 40 PSF. And so when we do this engineering design probability simulation, these places end up having similar reliability targeted loads, which are all at this value of around 60. Now I want to emphasize, we've never seen a load in any of these places that are around 60. And this goes back to the probability of structure failure that we're targeting is so low that we're pushing these probability distribution estimates beyond what we've observed, and for good reason, because we don't want to have failures. In fact, for your home, the target probability of failure is 0.13% in a 50-year service life. So that would mean if we lived through 750-year periods, we'd expect to see a failure in one of them. And all of us are living somewhere between 0.5 and 2, or maybe even 2.5 50-year periods. So it's just not going to happen. And that's why these values are so much higher than the observed data. And so the key point from that slide is that even though the typical snow year looks different in these 3 places, when we look at extreme probabilities, they end up looking fairly similar. And so one of the unique things that Wei and I are doing is that we're not just looking at data and probability and the science of probability, but we're trying to figure out ways that we can translate data to science to code. And when I say code, I mean building code, engineering codes and standards. So I'm part of committees that write, in fact, I wrote this language, it's in draft form, for how building codes would account for climate change in snow. And so this is mandated language that, if adopted, would change the way that every building is designed in Utah or any other place that looks at snow. And what we found, and what Utah State has been very supportive of, is making that step from the science to the code is its own science and art. And we've engaged in that and not just stopping at the science so that we can make sure that these things get adopted. And so we start with national standards. And these are the committees that I participate in. It's called ASCE 7. That enters into an international building code, and every state then decides whether or not to adopt that. On Wednesday, I talked with the engineers in Utah about adopting the National Building Code. And then eventually that makes it down to local communities where a building official, when you get a building permit, says, yes, this meets the code, your building's strong enough to be acceptable to design. That needs to be studied a lot more, that purpose of adoption. But Wei and I are trying to get here, get our science into the national standards so that it has the potential to be adopted locally. And so how do we use this data? Well, we take probability, these tale of 3 cities, now it's a tale of 7,500 cities, and we do these calculations and we make maps of the values that engineers need to use for design. So translating all of that science to a single value that calculates, that incorporates all those uncertainties and all those decisions that we have to make in engineering. But we've been doing this using historical data. And the question that Wei is helping, that we're answering together, but really I couldn't do it that way, is what do we do when we don't have data for what's going to happen? And so what do we do when the future doesn't look like the past?
So we look at the past first. When we look at the historical data of snow water equivalent, as we're seeing here, that's the trend in the peak snowpack in the western US. This red dots represents that there's a decreasing trend in the snow water equivalent, and when you look at blue dots, those are increasing trends. You can see that the vast majority of the sites for snow test station and for snow course, all those sites are showing that there is a very strong decrease in trend in the snow water equivalent in Utah and in the other western states. And why is that the case? As we know that jet streams are those up-level wind currents in the sky, and those jet streams can shift that distribution of temperature and precipitation. So as the climate gets warmer, that warmer climate would affect the waviness of the jet streams. And that is one of the reasons that leads to changes in the weather patterns that modulate snowfall, rainfall, and temperature. And this is a figure for the future. I took from the Nature Review Journal, published in 2021. This study shows the y-axis is the loss of snow water equivalent, which is focused on the Uinta and the Wasatch Basin, basically for Utah. So you can see that the loss of snow water equivalent based on this work is decreasing. So we are seeing that decreasing snow water equivalent, we are seeing that increase in the loss of the snow water equivalent. And when we are heading towards the end of 21st century, we are seeing that around 40% of that loss in snow water equivalent. And how do we know about the future? How do we know that the future, that creative path is reliable? So the tool that we use for future projection is a globe standard tool, which we call globe counter model or GCMs. This model, the first GCM was developed in GFDL. That is the lab that I worked for 2 years, so I had the privilege to work with those amazing scientists to develop these models. So these models are great tools to generate the future climate. they solve those equations and then giving the forcing from the atmosphere, they will give you the estimate for the future. But this future is not perfect, and we will never know exactly what will happen in 20, 50 years, right? So that's why we need statistics, and that's the domain that Brennan and I, we could work together by transferring those climate data to statistics and then to knowledge. So in those models, there are two things. One is that there is a very large bias in the simulations of snowfall, snow water equivalent. And there is another problem for this model is that the spatial resolution is very low. For example, one box of that model is around 100 kilometers. So that means the Salt Lake City would be just fitting in one spatial grid. But in reality, there are so many spatial heterogeneities in land use, land cover, in buildings, in lands. So one grid cannot represent so well what really happened there. We need another tool that's called downscaling. So the downscaling tools can help us to improve the quality of this data. And that's these tools come in. That's the big model, which is a variable infiltration capacity model, we call it WIC. So this model is a hydrological model, can take that output from those GCMs. Then they transfer that to a downscaled 4 kilometer resolution or even higher. That's the water equivalent, that's snowfall. And then we feed those data to Brennan's models.
And so we're going to go back to this picture where we're pitting snow loads versus the strength of the building. And we're asking, how might this curve actually morph over time? So instead of just assuming it stays the same year after year, what happens if it's changing every year? And so to talk about that change, we usually describe distributions by their average and their spread. Sometimes we call that the mean and the variance, or the mean and the standard deviation. What we are looking at in our research right now is saying, what if we let the mean and the standard deviation now be a function of time? In other words, the mean changes depending on what year you're in. And when we do that, we then ran several of these models that Wei's talked about, these global climate models, downscaled to a relatively fine resolution so we can resolve mountains versus valleys, running these VIC models so we can estimate snow based on the energy and the water that's put into that climate system. And we ask, if we just looked at historical climate model, they call them hindcasts, is the mean going up or down over time? And so if we see green, we have 32 different models. Green would suggest that a majority of the models said that the snow is actually going up over time. Pink means it's going down. This is only looking at the historical period. If we look at an intermediate climate scenario and we project to the end of the century, 2100, we get this plot. And so if we focus at Utah, it's kind of a mixed bag. It seems like snow means are decreasing in our mountains, mixed bag everywhere else. If we go to a high emission scenario, it's decreasing almost everywhere except for the upper Midwest. Now for engineers, this is a good thing. It means our buildings are going to be strong enough, and maybe we could even reduce loads with the exception of the upper Midwest. If we look at the spread of that data, so the mean kind of tracks where that distribution is centered. Sigma tracks how stretched out or compressed it looks. When we look at that at a function of time using historical data, there's a lot more green. It's more of a mixed bag. When we look at the intermediate scenario, Utah is mostly half of it's going up, half of it's going down. Really, it's all in the middle. The faint colors suggest some models said it went up, some said it goes down. And in the future, the high emission scenario, the reductions in snow load are great enough that we're not just reducing the mean, we're actually reducing the spread as well. And so for water resource management, if this is true, that's a bad thing for Utah. For engineering, it's a good thing for Utah. So take what you will from this. And so the takeaway from those maps is that our ongoing research is suggesting that extreme accumulations should be falling for most of the United States, at least CONUS. We aren't looking at Alaska, with the exception of the northern Midwest, where we saw more green across all of those plots over time. So that's the problem that Wei and I wanted to present to you today. We want to shift gears a little bit and just talk about what Wei and I are doing as a pattern for what can happen at a research institution like Utah State when data scientists, or whatever you want to call me, get together with people that actually know what they're doing, like Wei. And so we take these problems in these different disciplines and we distill it down to a data problem. And we then generalize that to new methods and software for solving those data problems, not just in the original domain, but in other domains tangent to that original problem. And so this is what I live by in my research program, is that statistics is the science that solves data problems. Today we presented you a data problem, and our hope is that the new Data Science Center at Utah State will help us solve a lot more of these data problems. And so keys to success for Wei and I is we need to learn a common language. And Wei, if you have anything you want to say about this, feel free. For me, it was like, Wei, what does this mean? Wei, what does this mean? Wei, when you say this, what does this mean? And learning an entirely new vocabulary so that we could speak. And I don't know if you had to learn any words. I feel like you were better prepared to talk to me than I was to you. But we had to learn that common language so we could solve problems together. And that means asking dumb questions to get smart insight. Asking really basic fundamental questions and not being worried about sounding stupid. Because sometimes when you ask something so fundamental, it helps both the domain expert and the statistician rethink, well, why do we do it that way? And is there a way that we could do it better? And so one way that we can facilitate this at Utah State is the new Data Science and AI Center, recently approved. Dr. Kevin Moon is the director, and the intent of this center is to foster collaborations like this across campus, across departments, so that we can harness these innovations in data science and AI to solve more data problems. So this is a sample website. I think it's about to go live if it's not live already. I took this from a few weeks ago, so it might look a little bit different. But the goal is to have the DSAI Center be a hub at USU for students, faculty, and external stakeholders to come together, generate new ideas, work on grants, and solve new problems. And so, as a final takeaway from today, I hope that we communicated that when we talk about engineering or water resource management, we have to make decisions today about the society we'll live in tomorrow. If I'm going to build a building, I have to be worried about how it's going to perform for my grandkids, not how it's just going to perform for me. And to do that, we have to rely on probability. We can't just use our personal experience. And then the other takeaway is that science's impact is maximized when people from different fields come together and walk that path from data to science to decisions. Both of us have been supported by a lot of people and a lot of students. This is just a cool picture of snow in Idaho. And the one that's supporting Wei and I right now, the project we're talking about jointly, is NOAA, but he has several other grants that are supporting both of us as we work on several different data problems. We thank you for your time, and we look forward to talking about questions.
I just want to emphasize, today we're talking about kind of the basics of team-based research. The way we're going to address the challenges of our future are absolutely going to be done with teams of people. And I want to really emphasize the importance of asking any question, because any question helps the researcher think about their next steps in research. And so I'm going to start with a question, but then I've got the mic. And people with questions, I'd love to see your hands up. I will run the mic around. And we're going to have a conversation for the next 20 minutes or so about data science, about snow, about outhouses with 10 feet of snow on the ground. But I'm going to start with a question. I'm a scientist, and so exactness feels comfortable to me.
Mm-hmm.
How do I get comfortable with thinking about being comfortable with probability as what I have to make a decision on?
Yeah. You just drink the Kool-Aid. No, I'm kidding. One of the things I like to talk about is consensus, which is we do not know what's going to happen. I think one of the great innovations in statistics that we have done a bad job of communicating to other fields is this idea of simulation, sensitivity analysis. So I say, okay, probability says this. What if I changed my data just a little bit? How much does that probability change? And if it's changing a lot, I don't know if I ever get comfortable with the probability. But if I have several different ways of looking at the problem and they all point towards the same thing, then I start to be comfortable. And that's why with that map of pink and green, it was 32 different climate models, and we were just letting them all vote. And we don't feel comfortable with the vote of any single one of them. But we feel fairly comfortable with the vote of all 32 of them.
Yeah, when we develop models, particularly those climate models, it's very complex. We have atmosphere, land, ocean, sea ice, all those things are mixed together. And we know there's uncertainty there. And we know that the uncertainty will still exist in given 20 years. And then are you waiting for 20 years to make any decisions about our future? We won't, right? We need to make decisions. So although these tools have uncertainties, but they are still useful and powerful tools.
Great, the questions are starting. We'll start right back here.
On the topic of teams solving the problem, whose job is it to disseminate science and effectively combat disinformation? Because climate science has been very robust and straightforward about this problem for 60 years. And apparently no one on the team knew it was their job to go and fight a multi-billion-dollar industry. So we just pull straws.
I think someone has to volunteer as tribute. No, I'm kidding. So when I think about my experience with working with engineers, and I want to, in full disclosure, there's a lot of resistance just to the stuff we did with historical work, let alone future climate change, right? And so the way that I approach it is that I need to find someone that's external to academe, right? So it can't just be all within Utah State. And my goal is to move the needle for that person a little bit. And I'm not going to take the responsibility of convincing them to see it exactly as I do. But if I can persuade them to think differently, better about it, then I feel like I've done my job. And sometimes that means sacrificing the whole story to get part of that story in. And so when I think about building codes and standards, we'd said things and not everyone agreed with it. And it was like, can I get you to agree with it at least partially? And that starts the conversation. And then I think we see these paradigm shifts over time as long as we keep kind of hitting the concrete wall with the sledgehammer, right? If we can keep putting cracks in that wall of disinformation, eventually it comes down. But we can't take responsibility for taking it down all by ourselves.
So this is kind of an interesting moment for me because today I had snow tires put on.
Yeah.
And the option was I had all season tires and they were worn out. So it was time to make a decision. And maybe it was my optimism that drove my decision to go for the snow tires. And then come spring, I'll get the all-weather again, depending, then at least I can hedge my bet, maybe. But I just think that what you're talking about with, reliability and targeted loads, I just gave snow 100% today.
Thank you. And as the guy that wrote the Utah law that the current law, and they're just trying to decide to do the national. I still shovel my roof off when it gets a lot of snow, because I know the probabilities, but I also don't know the engineer who designed my particular house. So, thanks for that.
So the NOAA's forecast for the coming winter, we are gonna expecting the La Nina conditions. So if you trust the NOAA's forecast, then we would expect a drier than normal year for Utah's climate. But that forecast failed in 2022, 2023. So yeah, we are still working on it, trying to improve the models, the tools. So yeah.
I have a question about rivers. I work with rivers a lot, and you know, there's a factor of safety that goes into bridges and other infrastructure in rivers. You know, we've seen these historic floods around the world in the last week, just in Spain, Italy. My family lives in Western North Carolina, and we're seeing completely unprecedented things. You're supposed to look back at the 100-year flood flows to design, and then you're supposed to put a factor of safety on that. And I've found that a lot of times the factor of safety makes your project so expensive you can't even do it. Mm-hmm. How do you justify, or how do you kind of weave that line between the probability of something happening versus the expense, and you know, what kind of tools are you generating that also bring in the public perception of those things? You know, it's don't fix it if it's not broken, and then the flood comes and washes everything out. You know, so
yeah,
factor of safety and how you deal with that.
Yeah. So at the national level, one way in which I can't remember if it was NPR or KSL just did an article about building codes and whether or not they're followed and how that affected Asheville. I'd encourage you to look at it, but these are consensus-based standards, and so there's some people like me, the academic weirdos, that are like, ooh, probabilities, and then there's other people that represent National Home Builders Association, American Wood Council, and so there is some conflicts there, and I think that it's in those conflicts that we start to negotiate this balance of, okay, how far do we go before we say it's just not worth it to try to save that, it would be easier to rebuild? And so my answer is that those things get negotiated. It's part of that going from science to code. Well, here's what the science says. How can we actually make that work? And there's a lot of people at the table, not just academics, that weigh in on that. And you can make public comments. So when these standards go out, anyone in the public, if you're watching, can make comments on whether or not this is appropriate or why you think it should be different. So there's a lot of opportunities for people to weigh in, and things do get changed based on those interests.
Ten or 15 years ago, I came to one of these research evenings like this. It was in the morning when they used to be at sunrise sessions. And one of them was on climate change. And like I say, that was probably 10 or 15 years ago now. And they came up with models of what they thought was going to happen with the Utah winters. And they talked about how we were getting as much snow as we usually do, but it's in a shorter period of time. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if those models have come to fruition, that we still are getting that amount of precipitation, or if that has gone down, you know, how the temperatures have changed over the last many years here in Utah.
Sure. I'm giving that one to you.
The temperature trend in Utah is increasing. That's based on the data, the station's data. For precipitation, the trend isn't so significant, but the snow water equivalent, the peak snow water equivalent is significantly decreasing right now. So the numerical models, many of those GCMs, they have some caveats in simulating and correcting the precipitation because of that spatial grid I just mentioned, that 100 kilometers, so they cannot really draw clouds. So the convection systems are parameterized. So that's a big uncertainty. In order to do that, we need to run those models at the 4-kilometer resolution. And that means we need a much larger computer. So we wouldn't expect that those global contour models can simulating those global precipitation and 4 or 1 kilometer resolution in a very adequate time. So there's still a large uncertainty there. But temperature simulation is pretty good. So that, and there's a consensus that those models are projecting a warmer future.
So that's come true for the
Yes,
models.
yes, that has been predicted 20 years ago.
I applaud you guys for doing this because Brennan and I, you have to have data. People can ignore it, the politicians, the decision makers, the whatever. But vis-a-vis building codes, you design a building to handle give you a low probability of failure over a certain period of time. Well, in 2004, I moved into a 102-year-old building in Chicago. Now, it was built with 14-foot wood beams, which looked pretty good from the garage when you looked at them. But they have a known, or presumably known, degradation of them, blah, blah, blah. And that gets factored in, I guess, but, and I know that black curve you showed is an amalgamation of lots of things. There's the structural strength when you build it, and then it degrades over time, or it doesn't, or this or that. But it's extremely complex, but unfortunately, from my standpoint, the non-science guys sometimes pull Trump, I shouldn't use that word. Decide, well, we're just not going to go with that.
Yeah, so you mentioned wood specifically, and that is, from an engineering design perspective, it's one of the materials we understand the least about in creating that black curve. So we know it degrades over time. We know that wood has another special property that if you give it a constant load, it will deform permanently. And so when we do these calculations, we assume that it's a steel structure. And that's not because we don't think wood's important. We just don't have the data to do this model of degradation over time. So absolutely, degradation is going to affect the reliability. And these models don't really account for that very well. I'm trying to think if I want to say any more about that. One thing I will say about the service life. We pick a probability of failure in a service life, but both of those things are somewhat arbitrary. We could have doubled the service life and changed the probability of failure to make things work. So 50 years was it was a target, not that we thought buildings would only last 50 years. And given the probability of failure, we're expecting them to last much longer than that.
But hopefully the code mandates reevaluation of the structural strength over time.
So most of the gripes that people have is, what do we do for an existing structure when we need to revamp it? And it was designed using an old code. What do we do? And that's a hard question to answer. And but it's one that we need to think a lot more about, because it does matter, and we can't just pretend like it's still the same safety, right?
I'm just curious, when you got up on your roof to shovel your snow, did the engineering calculations take into account the weight of you on the roof?
So when you do engineering calculations, we look at snow loads and live loads, and we decide which one governs. And so basically the way that the calculation works is, if it's just me on my roof, my weight distributed across the system is so small relative to the snow that I'm almost meaningless. Now when we put a whole church group up on there, I get a little nervous sometimes. It's like, how many are we going to get on there? But snow exerts a lot more weight than just a few people, so it becomes kind of negligible. Question in the front here.
I'm familiar with some of the growing degree hour models that the Plant Science Department at Utah State that developed decades ago. I guess my question is, has that modeling of correlation of climate and plant growth been expanded into, it was developed for things like apples and fruits. If the growers had to go out and heat their orchard that night, so they would lose some fruit buds. Has that model and technology been expanded to predict different types of positive or negative probabilities for different types of other plants, like range plants, forest plants, things of that nature? Does that make sense what I just said?
Yeah, I think it does. That's outside of my department. Do you know what they're doing with growing degree days?
I definitely know growing degree days, but I don't know the model. So right now, what I know is that right now, the crop modeling, many of the commodities like those models can simulate different crops, like wheat, corns, vegetables, fruits. So those models can simulate that. And right this morning, so I'm now co-instructing the climate adaptation science program. They are working on a project to understand the future of gray soil by taking into account water use, different crops. So we invited a crop model from NCAR, National Center for Atmospheric Research, Dr. John Jeffrey, to give us an introduction to crop modeling. So he mentioned these models, and it's very widely used right now. So the models can be designed to simulate crop growth for different types of crops. But I'm not very familiar with the model that we have in TSC. I don't know whether Dean Dr. Kumar.
Do you know it?
Okay.
Yeah.
That's great.
Thank you. This is Greg Cuomo, the Dean of the College of Ag and Applied Sciences.
And I was told you don't really have to know what you're talking about. You just have to sound like you know what you're talking about. And I'm not sure I understood your question entirely. They're using those models and working with the climate centers to do things like that. Find freeze warnings for food orchards, so they can give warnings to growers ahead of time. When they can anticipate freezes, they can do disease prediction for crops, thinking how can we best, for fruit growers or any growers, or how can we start to understand the climate and the weather and how that impacts diseases and those things. So using them, the growing degree days is just it's number of hours above 65 degrees, but it's just a way to predict how rapidly things will grow and mature. But using that with the climate, things are able to really refine a lot of stuff. We can do this if you want.
Yeah, in the back. Okay. We got time for maybe one additional question after this one, so somebody be thinking of a good one.
I don't know if this is a good one, but it's another example. And just yesterday, I was at my equestrian center up in Heber, and we were looking at the structure, which is steel. And when I was talking with my trainer, he said, when we conceived of this design and we were asked about the steel, did we want to have the reliability of the targeted load of Park City or of Heber? Now, I don't know that there's that much of a distinction, but with the two outstanding water snow years that we had, there were barns that were just, twisted. And but it's interesting that we were talking about this very thing yesterday. So, kismet.
Yeah.
Okay, yes, right up in front. The final question is coming from the front row, guys.
All the pressure.
All the pressure.
I just have really a local question. As I think about climate change and warming up and you see the Great Salt Lake start to decline, how big of a deal is lake effect in projections?
I'm going to let Wei go on that first.
The effects of the water body on precipitation?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I published a paper this summer with my postdoc. So we designed a different scenarios for the Great Salt Lake when the water body changes from 100% to 75 to 50 to 25 to totally dry up. And what we found is that the result is it's very surprising that decrease of precipitation downstream in the Wasatch Front when given a storm, that's around 20%. So basically, given the same storm that moved across the Great Salt Lake, if that Great Salt Lake totally dried up, that decrease of precipitation is astonishing. It's very large. So we published this paper this year in Journal of Meteorology, and we were interviewed different reporters on that. So we are now looking at more cases, and to run the model for a more longer period of time to generate the findings and trying to provide some information to the folks about maybe another reason to see about Bristol Lake, right? That lake effect is very large based on my simulations. Thank you.
Let's thank our speakers again